Oh, very nice.
Yep. Okay, so we are back to Yoredeya. This is the last volume 7. We will complete Mirza Hashem Yoredeya when we finish volume 7. And these are going to be the Hilchos Niddah. For many of us, it's going to be a reminder from memory about a lot of the dinim. But you all have children and grandchildren, and where it's much more relevant. And many times they'll ask the elder person in the house, especially if they know that they've studied the material. And so this is an opportunity for us to be choizer things that were very nogea for us when we were younger. So in this volume we're on page 25. This volume will focus on the laws of Niddah and Taras HaMishpacha. Many of the particular halachos involved affect women more directly than men, but it's important both spouses be familiar with these important halachot and learn how to apply them in practical manner. Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, who wrote Darchei Tahara, expressed this idea in the following excerpt that is taken from the introduction to that sefer. Rav Mordechai Eliyahu was the chief rabbi of Israel. Hilchos Niddah hein me'hilchos hakashos. These are challenging halachos. Afal pi shehein shchichos v'tadiros, even though it's something that comes up all the time. Hayeda bahen dal. He says the knowledge about these halachos is very poor. He says kamen sibos l'davar. He tries to explain why is it that there's such a lack of information regarding Hilchos Niddah. He says li'itim. At times, the wife relies on her husband. He's lazy, and he didn't really study it appropriately. He relies on what he learned in the past. He heard something about it. From this little knowledge, it's like he acts as if he's a big maven. Just the opposite. Sometimes the husbands will rely on their wives who went to seminary. Maybe she didn't go to seminary, and maybe she learned from her mother or from a friend. And then, because there's a Yetzer Hara involved in this activity, Mikabelas he ozu posekes bidvar mo'em demum shalola. They might make a decision that really is not appropriate la'alacha because the Yetzer is involved as well. So mitzvahs limud alich hilchos niddah lefachos achas lechodesh. He says it's important to review these halachas once a month. Kadesh lo yikashel b'surei kores. Because there's Isser Kores involved. It's important for him to know what's permitted, what's prohibited. And in fact, he has to ask a Talmid Chacham if he doesn't know what's going on. If a person follows that kind of schedule, he will be meritoriously rewarded. He won't fail. Of course, a chassan kala. In their first year of marriage, Arishona, they should learn it together, review it together. And sometimes review it by themselves. And ask a lot of shilas. Until they'll have a very good understanding of the halachas. Isser niddah kamo ki isser arayos. Violating an Isser Niddah is like the prohibited relations. You can't live with a sister, can't live with an aunt. All the prohibited relations, same din. When we say that you're supposed to allow yourself to be killed, that's by shvichas damim, avodah zara, and arayas. I.e., somebody puts a gun in a person's head and says, bow down to that idol. Or kill that person, otherwise I'll kill you. So you're supposed to allow yourself to be killed. Or they say, have relations with that woman, even though it's an Isser, prohibited or Isser Barais. You're supposed to allow yourself to be killed because it's your heart Vayavar. V'chomer Isser Zeh. Therefore, Adam Yaschil Lachshav ala Hiskatshus, the difficulty and the kedusha involved. Yilamin Hilchos Niddah Amanasli Skadesh. He wants to become holy. Uliminana mituma, avoid tuma va'ayidei zeh. Ezra Hashem Yisrael Skadesh milmal shleyaval l'deichem. So this is an introduction that Rav Eliyahu gives to give people chizuk in this. So in the first year tonight, we'll introduce some of the basic principles of this area. These include a basic understanding of the biblical and rabbinic definitions of niddah and zava, how they impact upon the practical halacha, and some of the necessary conditions for a woman to be rendered a niddah. In the subsequent shiurim, we will outline the basic halachic cycle of menstruation purification, examine other important aspects of the halacha, including the rabbinic rules of ketamim, a kesem, if you find a stain of blood. What about the requirement of bedikos, internal examination, to check for bleeding, and the conditions for immersing in a mikveh to become pure? So let's talk about niddah and ziva days according to the Torah law and Chazal. As opposed to some areas of halacha, the laws of Taharas HaMishpacha, as they are presented by the Torah, differ significantly from how they have been adapted on a practical level. We will begin by outlining the rules that they are given by the Torah, and then explain how the rules observed today developed from there. According to the Torah, blood that issues from the uterus of a woman renders her ritually impure tameh. The word tameh, of course, has an implication regarding tumah v'tahara, which we don't really follow today. In terms of if you touch something, it becomes tameh or tohar. We're all tameh because in the state that we're in today with tumas mace, we're all in a state of tumah. So when we refer to a woman being tameh, it also implies that she's prohibited to her husband, which is the practical application for saying that she is rendered tameh. However, the terms of that impurity depend upon the circumstances of her discharge. In the case of niddah, regular menstruation, the Torah states in the first pasuk quoted below that she is impure for 7 days. While in the case of ziva, which is we're going to define as an unexpected discharge, the Torah states in the second pasuk below that she must also count 7 days before she becomes pure. The first pasuk, v'isha ki tiezavadam, if she's going to flow blood, she's going to be in a state of nidus for 7 days. Then it says in the next pasuk, if she has a bleeding discharge, not at the time of her niddah period, she has to count 7 clean days. So what is this distinguish? How do you distinguish between niddah and ziva? So according to the Ramban,
the word niddah is what? Impure? What does the word niddah mean?
So it's a halachic status where that if the blood came from her uterus, it renders her a niddah. We'll see.
So
with
is is automatically a niddah.
No. I'm going to say something that's not in the Tzurba like this. The women had an 18-day cycle called 7 days of nidus, followed by 11 days of zivus. Our women today, in general, do not know where they are in that cycle. But in the time of the Torah, women were from the first time they ever had blood, so like this. If a woman bleeds during her nidus period, during those 7 days of work, which is called a nidus period, even if she bled for all 7 days, but there were 3 hours at the end of the day where she stopped bleeding, she would be able to go to the mikveh that night and be permitted to her husband, according to Torah law. Because nidus, if she bled for 3 days or 4 days, she would be tameh for 7 days. You're tameh for 7 days during the nidus period. You don't have to count 7 days afterwards. Then after the 7 days period, and let's say that night she lived with her husband. There's the next 11 days where if she sees blood during those 11 days, that's called her zivus period. If in those 11 days, she has 3 days in a row where she sees blood, she becomes what's called a Zava Gedola. A Zava Gedola now is Tameh for 7 days. She has to count 7 clean days before she emerges from that. And then on the 8th day, she would bring korbanos. Now, so let's say a woman was...
Ziva has 2 days. Let's say 2 days of bleeding.
So during the 11 days of Zivus, Minat Torah, if she bled for 1 day, and then she stopped for 1 day, so that's called Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom, she would be able to go to the mikveh that night, the day after her clean night, and live with her husband. If she bled for 2 days in the Zivus period, she could then also, if the 3rd day she was clean, it's also called Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom. You have to watch 1 day, you have to watch 2 days, 1 day, and she'd be permitted to her husband that night. Now, if she bled 3 days in a row during that 11-day period, she becomes a Zava Gedola. Now, let's say during those, she had 7 days of Nidus, followed by 11 days of potential Zivus, and let's say she didn't see any bleeding in those 11 days. The next time she saw blood, let's say on day 19, 20, 21, that begins her Nidus cycle again. And that's, she has 7 days of Nidus, followed by 11 days of Zivus. This is the construct that existed for Torah law, which obviously is not our law. Now, so we're going to see, in essence, we're going to learn tonight that our women treat even 1 drop of blood as if the potential that she could be a Zava Gedola, where she had bled for 3 days. How come she didn't see it? Well, maybe she didn't notice it. Day 1, day 2, and this is the 3rd day of Zivus bleeding, and therefore now she has to count 7 clean days before she's permitted to her husband for any blood. That's where the Chumrah is going. Now, how did we get from where the Torah was to that Chumrah, which is how we live? Let's learn tonight. But that's just an overview. That gives a little bit of fundamental. According to the Ramban and other Rishonim, the Rambam has a different approach that they're not going to go into. The primary difference between Niddah and Ziva is that Niddah involves bleeding caused by natural biological process, like menstruation. Remember, menstruation is a process where the uterus, through hormonal mechanisms, had tissues laid in the uterus to prepare for a potential zygote, a potential embryo. As the hormones, let's say then she does not get fertilized with a zygote, the hormones drop, and this deciduous tissue that's been built up in the uterus can no longer be supported by, there's no hormones to support it, so it sloughs. So, and that cycle occurs monthly. So that's the menstrual cycle. That's a natural biological process. So that's why they want to say, the Rishonim feel that 7 days of Nidus is biological, as opposed to Zivus, which refers to unusual bleeding. That's why the pasuk described it as outside the time of her menstrual separation. Accordingly, the process of purification for a Zava, and specifically a Zava Gedola, which was a 3-day bleed as opposed to a 2-day bleed, which would make her a Zava Ketana, is a longer and more complicated process than the purification process for a Niddah. Remember, gentlemen, after Niddah, there was no bringing a korban. And not only that, as I said, as long as there was a few hours, as long as there was a stoppage of bleeding on day 7, she could go to the mikveh that night and live with her husband. There was no counting 7 clean days. Nidus doesn't require that. And it doesn't require a korban. Being a Zava Gedola required now Sfiras 7 days. You have to count 1, 2, you have to check yourself during those 7 days and make sure that you're not bleeding in those 7 days. And if, let's say on day 5 of you're counting and you count 5 and all of a sudden you see blood, you got to start counting from beginning. And you have to have 7 consecutive clean days. Then on the 8th day, they brought a korban, 2 birds. So you see the purification, the complete purification for a Zava was much more complicated than purification for a Niddah.
But Niddah, if she stopped bleeding after Niddah now, after 5 days, she still has to wait
2 days,
7,
2 days,
no matter
2
what.
more days. So Jerry just asked, let's say she was in her Niddah period, she bled for 5 days. She was not permitted to her husband. She had to still count another 2 days, even though she didn't see bleeding on that day. She was at a minimum 7 days. Let's say she bled for 2 days during her Niddah period. She'd have to count another 5 days. But that's not the same concept as counting 7 clean days. That's this concept that according to the Torah, if you're a Niddah, you're going to be a Niddah for a minimum of 7 days, whether you bled for 3 days or 5 days or 6 days or whatever it is. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is you needed to have a separate, you have to stop bleeding. So let's say a woman is in her 7th day, 8th day, 9th day, and never stopped. So she never left her Niddah period. She needs to, there has to be a closure of the uterus before it's considered that the Niddah period is over, and then she can go to the mikveh and be permitted to her husband. And that's an unusual case, but that can happen.
Why can't you say it's considered Ziva?
No, is that because there has to be a stoppage of blood for the
Oh,
Niddahs
okay.
to stop? Because it's almost viewed as a different source, as if you turned a faucet from this thing, and now you're turning a faucet for something else. So you got to see closure of uterine bleeding before you move on into the next period. And we're going to see, I'm sure that Tzurba is going to deal with this. This is very relevant for women who have surgical procedures, a DNC, a cone biopsy, other procedures in the uterus. Now, we'll see, is that considered a wound? And maybe blood from a wound is not considered blood that's going to make her a Niddah. So these are the issues we're going to deal with. And these are the issues that the poskim who are experts in these laws, it's always these issues, the medical issues, women who have unusual patterns of bleeding. They bleed all this, that's very difficult in Jewish marriage, where they had irregular menstrual bleeding. To figure out exactly, when she could be permitted is sometimes very difficult. Okay, and we're going to learn some of those things as we go through all of this. Now, how do we determine if a woman's bleeding constitutes Niddah or Ziva? The answer is that it depends upon when the bleeding occurs. According to most Rishonim, if she bleeds within the 11 days that follow an episode of Niddah, like we talked about, 7 with 11, this is considered untimely or unusual bleeding, and she's deemed to be a Zava. However, right, if there was 7 and then 11 days and then more than 11 days, right, the bleeding begins more than 11 days after her last menstrual cycle, her bleeding is now viewed as the beginning of a new episode of regular Niddah period. So that's how the women in previous generations kept track. And the women did keep track. From the first time they ever had a period, they would monitor, this was something that they would know, are they in their Niddah period or Ziva's period? It's possible that some women know that Bisman Hazeh, but that would be unusual, I think. According to the Gemara Niddah, the significance of the number 11 derives from a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Halachic tradition that Moshe received from Hashem at Sinai was not recorded explicitly by the Torah. It says Masechta Niddah Ayin Beis Daf Beis. Chatzi log shemen letoda. The fact that when you brought a korban toda, the amount of oil that went along with that korban was half a log. Urevius yayin lenozir, and the din that a revius yayin is the amount of wine that a nazir gets punished for, because a nazir takes a vow not to drink wine. And the kicker, v'achad asar yom shebei niddah leniddah, and this 11-day period between one Niddah cycle and the other Niddah cycle, halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So, according to the biblical model, 2 substantial halachic differences distinguish the Zava from the Niddah in terms of becoming pure. The Zava has to count 7 clean days, known as Shiva Nikiyim, 7 clean days. And then she brings an offering on the following day, on day 8, the day following the 7 days. Let's explain. By the way, let me give you not a mnemonic, but a yesod. Any tumah that emanated from a person's body, in all those cases, you required not only counting 7 clean days, but you needed to bring a korban. So for example, the classic case was if you touched a dead body, or you were in the room with a dead body, tumas oil. The din is you were tummy for 7 days. You needed to be sprinkled with paradum on the 3rd and 7th day. And you had to go to the mikvah on the 7th day. That night, you already told her you could eat truma and kodshim. There was no korbanos brought on the 8th day. That's an external tumah. But there are 4 examples where tumah emanates from a person's body. Zivus, right? We've just been dealing with zava. Tsaras, you become leprosy. A yoledes, a woman who gives birth. So she's also in a state of tumah. And a zav, it's a male. If you have a male, can also have an emission. In all of those cases where the tumah emerged from your body, it's part of your guf, there's this extra stringency that you need to bring korbanos on the 8th day. By all other tumah, for example, if you touch nevela, which is tomei, you touch a sheretz, a dead sheretz. So that's your tomei for 1 day. You go to the mikvah, you need hair of shemesh, and the night falls, and that night you can already eat truma and kodshim. These 4 examples, like we said, zav, zava, yoledes, and saras, they cannot eat kodshim until the 8th day when they bring korbanos. It's just something to know. So let's explain. Midaraisa, the ritual impurity engendered by the state of niddah applies for a minimum of 7 days, like Jerry asked. If you bleed for 5 days, you still got to count another 2 days. The minimum of 7 days from the onset of the bleeding. Even if a woman continues to bleed during this time, now listen to the next sentence. So long as the bleeding has ceased by the end of the 7th day, she may immerse and become purified the following night, which is the night which begins the 8th day, means the night immediately after the 7th day. So you're right, there has to be a stoppage of bleeding. The bleeding continues past 7 days. She may immerse the first night after the bleeding has ceased. So for example, let's say she stops bleeding on the 8th day. She stops bleeding on the 9th day. She stops bleeding on the 10th day. And then let's say before nightfall, she's had a period where she can stop. She can go to the mikveh that time. But you notice she remains a niddah until that fountain closes. Okay. Additionally, it should be noted that a niddah's purification does not require a korban. Now, when it comes to a zava, so there's 2 types of zava. If she experiences uterine bleeding over the course of 1 or 2 consecutive days, she is a minor zava, called a zava katana. In this case, if she observes a full day without bleeding, right? If after 1 day or 2 days of bleeding, she has a 3rd day or a 2nd day where there's no bleeding, so she may subsequently immerse and become purified. Because the impurity may be halted by immersion after a single day without bleeding, a woman in this category is called shomeres yom keneged yom. She observes 1 day opposite another day. Okay, so that's what so when you hear in halachic literature shomeres yom keneged yom, we're referring to the period in the 11 days of nidus where a woman bled for either 1 or 2 days, but then stopped for 1 day. She could go to the mikvah minat Torah and have relations with her husband. That is not our halacha. Our halacha went further to develop chumras. But minat Torah, that was the law. If, however, the untimely discharge of blood continues for at least 3 consecutive days, right, during that 11 days of nidus, she now has the status of a major zava. In order to return to a state of purity, she must count 7 full consecutive days without bleeding, shiva nikim. She may then immerse on the 7th day and become purified. And even after immersing, she is required to complete an atonement process consisting of the offering of 2 turtle doves or young pigeons. One is an ola, one is a chatas. See, these halachas are not relevant for us today because we don't eat kodshim. We don't have a Beis Hamikdash. We don't have kodshim. So there's no purpose Even if, let's say, a woman becomes a Zava today, she has to count Zion clean days. She goes to the mikveh that night and she's now purified to live with her husband. That's the only practical halacha that remains. There is no practicality of the 8th day anymore of bringing korbanos because we don't eat kodshim. You could eat truma already the night of the 7th, but we don't have truma either today. So, anyways, so after she presents these offerings on the 8th day or thereafter, she's permitted, number one, to enter the temple and partake of consecrated foods, such as. Hang on, let me just make sure I don't have the page. No, I'm good. Such as they mentioned shlomim because that was the typical korban that regular Jews would eat of. Remember, a chatas, Saul, you're a Kohen, was only eaten by male Kohanim. An asham, which was a certain type of offering also for certain averos, were only eaten by male Kohanim. But when a person brought a korban shlomim, so after the Zrikas Adam, everyone could partake of the meat, including the balabais. Of course, korban Pesach would be considered kodshim, and you wouldn't be able to eat of that korban either, unless you were purified. Now, in the cases of both Niddah and Zava, they are considered avot hatuma, primary sources of impurity, such that a woman in either state will convey impurity of mishkav and moshav, bedding and seating. Now, let me explain that. We've talked about if you touch somebody, you can convey tumah. Or if you touch food, for example, you can convey tumah. Now, let's say there are 10 mattresses piled up one on top of each other. And a woman with tumas zivus or nidus sits on top of the uppermost mattress. Even though she's not touching the 9 mattresses she's not sitting on, but technically she's resting on it. So all mattresses become tummy. Let me tell you something else. Let's say there's a sofa. Let's say there's a loaf of bread on the other side of the sofa, and she sits on the sofa, so she contaminates that bread. That's through tumas mishkav. So moshav and mishkav, this is special stringencies. Normally, you'd have to touch it. Here, she's not touching it. She's just sitting it. She's 10 feet away from it. But that's the stringency of this type of tumah. So when you say something has tumas mishkav and moshav, it refers to those stringencies. That's midoraisa, correct. But again, Bernie, bisman hazeh, there's no relevance to tumah v'tahara. But I mean, when we were living in an era where you had to know whether something was tameh or not, because if you're a Kohen, you can't eat something that's tameh. We Yisraelim, we are not. There's no law. It's a lav for a Kohen to be tameh himself. Yeah. That's why a Kohen cannot walk into a hospital that does autopsies because it might be considered tumas. Oh well. But there's no problem for us because there's no law against us to do it. Now, there were Jews called chaverim who acted as if they were Kohanim. And even though Yisraelim are not obligated to avoid tumah, they conducted themselves that way. And therefore, there's a dipole. There's somebody called a chaver and somebody called an amoretz. An amoretz in the time of Chazal didn't really refer to somebody who was unlearned. It referred to somebody who didn't keep stringency tumah v'tahara. So when we say people didn't eat by each other, it wasn't about kashrus. People might not have eaten at somebody's home because he was a chaver and somebody else was an amoretz. Not regarding learning, ignorance, but regarding the stringency that he dealt with his food, b'tumah v'tahara. That's why we say, Misha'asa Nisim, when we bench Rosh Chodesh, how do we end that prayer? We say, Chavei, Hu yigalo tanu b'karov, v'kabes nidachenu ma'arbakan fa'aretz, Chaveirim kol Yisrael v'nomer amen. Now, probably most people, when they hear that tefillah, they're thinking it's like, Chaveirim, like, we're all going to be friends. No. This is a technical halachic statement that we're saying. We want Mashiach to come, Because the din is when we gathered on Yontif, when we made Aliyah Regel, everybody was considered a chaver.
Is this different than Hasidim Rishonim?
Well, no, because Hasidim Rishonim is something else. We're talking about Chaverim Kol Yisrael. So the word chaver there referred to this technical issue of Tumah V'Tahara. Okay. So they are. By the way, we're learning Hilchos Niddah. You're supposed to say knock yourself out. You're supposed to say knock yourself out. Did you have something in Machon Gold? They did. There were not necessarily. Used to be you thought you would be sent to seminary, but our girls didn't necessarily do all of that.
That's not true. They did it in Eula, Rambam, and seminary.
Okay. Whoa. Whoa. Okay. Okay. So a Niddah and a Zava are avos atuma. And she will convey impurity by touch and certainly by intimate relations. Nowadays, of course, we are no longer particular about the halachos of purity and impurity, though we will see in subsequent shiurim that certain aspects of these halachos may still impact upon the laws of stains. Number two, intimate relations are prohibited until the woman returns to a state of purity. So thus far, we have outlined the basic Torah level concepts of the categories of Niddah and Zava, as well as the differences between them. I'm going a little slower today, like we did. I don't know if you remember when we learned Basar B'Chalav and when we learned some of the Taruvit, when we first started learning the subjects of kashrus, we went very slow because I think to build the foundations properly, I want to make sure that everybody that we're on the same plane foundationally. So now we've gone through the Torah level concepts of the categories of Niddah and Zava, as well as the differences between them. However, it may be difficult or confusing at times to precisely determine in which category a particular woman who is bleeding is classified. Chazal instituted a number of ordinances, takanot, in order to prevent the errant abuse of severe prohibitions and to streamline the purification process from either impurity. So first, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who lived 180 CE, he eventually wrote down the Mishnayos, right, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, in order to prevent a woman from mistaking an incidence of Zava Gedola for the more routine Niddah, such as where she became confused as to which part of her cycle she was in, which result in her falsely regaining purity without the requisite Shiva Nikiyim required for Zava Gedola, right? For example, if she thought she was a Niddah and she's counted 5 days, so well, I only have to count 2 more days, but maybe she's a Zava and she needs 7 clean days. That's what he's referring to here. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi ordained that a woman must uniformly observe the Shiva Nikiyim every time she experiences 3 consecutive days of bleeding. So this is the first level of chumrah that developed. That if you see 3 days of bleeding, you're gonna have to count Zayin Nikiyim. Now, it could be that she's a Niddah, and maybe she only has to count 4 more days. Remember, we said a minimum of Niddah is 7. Like you asked me, well, what if she had bled for 5? Let's count another 2. Well, she could be a Niddah, but she doesn't know. So therefore, you have to assume that she's a Zava Gedola and count Zayin Nikiyim before she can have relations. And this enactment was reported by the Amoraim in the Gemara in Niddah. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda Marav. So these are Amoraim who lived in the generation after Rav Yehuda Nasi. They declared, Hiskin Rebbe Besados. Rebbe in the field declared the following takana. Rasa Yom Echad Teshev Shisha V'hu. If she saw 1 day bleeding, well, she should count 6 more days because maybe she could be a Niddah only. Shneim Teshev Shisha V'hein. Right? She should, if she saw 2 days of bleeding, she should count a total of 6 days, and both those 2 days for a total of 8 days. Shlosha Teshev Shiv Negim. Now, Rashi explains what's going on here. So first of all, Besadois. What is this that he was in the fields? Which meant Makom She'ein Sham B'nei Torah. He was in an area where the people really didn't know these halachos. And therefore the women were confused between whether they were nidot or zavos. The einan yodos lamanos pesach nidos say, and they didn't know how to calculate the cycles. Matayin yemei nida. That's how Rashi explains Matayin yemei zov. So if she bled for one day, shisha v'hu kedin Torah v'shem b'mei nidahu. What's the shnayim? Teishev shisha v'hein. 6 more days and the 2 lechumra, because shema rishon sof zov v'sheni tchilas nida, like this. Maybe the first day was the end of maybe a zov period, and now the second day is the first day of a nida period. So then, if it's a nida period, you've got to count 6 more days to make. Remember, 1 plus 6 equals 7. Look at the Jerry question. So tzricha od shisha. Aval shlosha, but if she has 3 consecutive bleeding days, the ilu havi yemei ziva tzricha zayin nekiyim. If she's a zava, she's got to count 7 clean days as a zava. Hashtanami choshav shiva nekiyim shem b'mei ziva imedes. So the basic rule is, if she sees bleeding for 3 days, she could be a zava, and therefore she's got to count 7 clean days, no matter what. According to Rashi, Rav Yehuda Nasi's enactment was designed to ensure that those places in which Niddah and Ziva days may be confused will still cover all the scenarios. Thus, if she bled for 1 day, we must concern that she's a Niddah and she therefore waits 7 days. Gentlemen, think about it. We're not assuming that maybe she's in her Nidus period, in her Zivus period, and this is the 1 day. Remember, she's a Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom. Remember, if you're in your Zivus period, if you bled for 1 day, you could technically be clean the next day and go to the mikveh that night. But no, he's going at L'chumra. He's saying maybe this is a 1 day menstrual cycle, L'chumra, and therefore count 6 more days because maybe she's a Niddah. So that's L'chumra. Because if it was Ziva, she would only be a Zava Ketana for 1 or 2 days of bleeding. If she bleeds for 2, so there also, remember, gentlemen, we learned a 2-day bleed could be cured by a 1 day no bleeding. Remember, she's a Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom. But now Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is assuming, no, maybe the first day was a Zav and the second day is the first day of Nidus, and she's got to count 6 clean days. Okay? The first day was Ziva and the second was Nidus, for which she must wait 7 more days. If both were Ziva again, she would not need to wait 7 days. So we're clearly going L'chumra. Now, if she bleeds for 3 days, so if we assume she was a Niddah, she would only have to count 4 more days to finish up 7. Right. But we don't know. She could be a Zava. Now she's stuck. She bled 3 more days. You got to count Zayin Nikiyim. Right? We must be concerned that perhaps it is Ziva blood, in which case she is a Zava Gdol and waits Shiva Nikiyim. Did everybody get that? And that's a very important step for us to understand. That's the first chumrah that developed in the halacha process. Then came the chumrah of Rav Zera. Rav Zera is in the 3rd or 4th generation of the Amoraim after Rebbe. The last generation was Rav Ashi. Rav Zera is before them. So you're talking about the period of the year 200 to 500 is the Amoraic period. So it's during this period that these chumras developed. So the Gemara and the continuation of the Sugi reports that some generations later, in the period of the Amoraim, Rav Zera codified an additional stringency, that one must count Shiva Nikiyim, like a Zava Gedola, even upon seeing a small amount of blood on 1 day only.
So she's a Niddah. She thinks she's a Niddah. She saw blood 1 day.
No, but Jerry, that's the point. So hang on.
They don't think.
Not that they don't think. Rebbe went to a place called Sodois, where the women had lost count of whether she was in her Nidus period or her Zivus period. And that's the state of most women. So Rebbe...
They didn't bleed. They weren't bleeding anything. All of a sudden, 1 day, she's bleeding.
But Jerry,
What do you
unless you started from when they were 12 years old, the first time they ever saw bleeding, and she had, let's say, a 4-day bleed, and then she counted, okay, 1, 2, 3, I've completed my nidus. Now there's 11 days of zivus. Now when do I bleed next? Now that's let's say on day 23, I'm now beginning my first day of nidus period, followed by 11. All our women have lost that count. So when you just described woman starts bleeding, You don't know whether that's nidus bleeding or zivus bleeding.
Makes no difference.
Yes, it
We're
does.
assuming it's Niddah, okay?
No, you're not assuming that it's we just went this thing about day 1, day 2, day 3. I just told you that if a woman bled for 1 day, if she was in her zivus period, all she has to do is keep 1 clean day and go to the mikveh
Right.
the next night. But if she's in her nidus period, that's her first day of a 7-day period, so she has to count 6 more days. But we don't know when she is.
Right.
So Rebbe said, if you see blood 1 day, you got to count 6 days. If you see bleeding for 2 days, you also have to count another 6 days, because he said the first day could be a zav, could have been a last day of the 11 days of zivus, and now her 2nd day bleeding might have been the first day of nidus bleeding. So if that's the first day, she needs to count another 6 days. 1 + 6 = 7. So if you bled for now, even though if she was in her zivus period and had bled for 2 days, she could have cured herself with 1 clean day. Remember we learned you're a shomeris yom keneged yom. So Rebbe began the stringency of bleeding 2-3 days. Now Rav Zera says that even if you bleed for 1 day, you've got to count Zayin Nikiyim. Om Rav Zera, B'nos Yisrael Ichmir al Atzman. Jewish women were stringent on themselves. Shafilu rose tipas dam kachardo. They saw blood the size of a mustard seed. Yoshvos alea shiva nikiyim.
Because it could be a Niddah, because it could be Niddah.
No.
Why?
Because
If
you
she
only
sees-
count Zayin Nikiyim after you're a Zava Gedola. Zayin, remember, Zayin Nikiyim means I need to have 7 consecutive clean days. Remember, Jerry, in a Niddah,
But she
in
sees
a
blood, Debbie.
Niddah, if a woman bled for 6 days and then for 7 days, and then she stopped bleeding for 3 hours before nightfall, Minat Torah, that woman could go to the mikveh that night and live with her husband.
Right.
That's because that's Niddah. There's no requirement to count 7 clean days. Let me tell you about the counting 7 clean days. She counts 6 days. On the 6th day, she checks herself, she sees blood. She's got to count another 7 clean days. Zayin Nikiyah means you need to have 7 consecutive days. Sometimes it's 7 days, sometimes it's 10 days, sometimes it's 11 days.
I see.
So whenever you see them say she has to count Zayin Nikiyah, you know that they're dealing with a chumrah that she's a Zava Gedola.
Right.
Okay. So Rav Zera, although this stringent practice of counting Shiva Nikiyim for even a small amount of blood does not appear to have been initiated by Chazal, it was accepted and confirmed by them, because it sounds like the women developed this takana and Chazal went along with it. As the Ramban writes, this stringency, which has been practiced by Jewish women, has been accepted by the sages. This is the Ramban writing in the year 1200. This is the Ramban's writing 800 years ago. They have treated it as every other codified halacha, and accordingly, one may never be frivolous respecting this practice. In a similar vein, the Gemara even cites Rav Zera's stringency as a proper example of a standardized halacha. If you look in Brachos 31a, they're going to say, what's considered a halacha psuka? It's this din of Rav Zera. This stringency referred to by Rav Zera is further explained by the Tur. Rav Yaakov Ben Asher in his monumental The Tur. Misha Rabu Agalios, we had a lot of exiles, V'takvat sorrows, we had all these persecutions, V'nismatu alavavos, and therefore our hearts have diminished. Choshu shema yavo litos b'yisr kores. So it was thought people were going to be oiver averis that lead to kores. Shematira isha b'mei nidasa shisha yomim, v'yeh kol dam tohor. For example, maybe she has bleeding during the 6 days, which is a routine time of Niddah, and maybe it's a kind of blood that is pure. We'll see there are types of bleeding that would be not Tomei Dika bleeding. Uvashvi shamatira dam Tomei, but maybe on the 7th it was Tomei. But Tzvura Litvol B'leil Shmini, that's really her first day of Nidus. She thinks she can already go to the mikvah on the 8th day, on the night of the 8th. They decided enough of this. Any red blood, in order to avoid this confusion Are they in their 7 days of nidus or 11 days of zivus? Any blood, hoisifu chumra achar chumra, says the Torah. Right? First you have the chumra of Rebbe, then you have the chumra of Rav Zera. Ad sha'amru shafilu im lo tera latipas dam chardal. That's the last chumra, where even a 1 day bleeding, one spot of blood, the size of a mustard seed, teshav ala shiva nakim kizava gedola. See that last word? Kizava gedola. Now that you're going to ask me, well, what happened to be a zava gedola? You have to bleed for 3 days. So why did she become a zava gedola after 1 day? She didn't see the blood the first 2 days. It dropped out of her, whatever. Yeah, we're going lechumra all the way. That this is maybe the 3rd day of Zivus bleeding, and she didn't see the first 2 days. That's really what we have to say. That's what the chumra is all about. According to the Tur, the purpose of the additional stringency of Rav Zera was to ensure that no confusions arises from Niddah and Ziva. See the Beis Yosef there, who discusses why being stringent for even a small amount of blood is necessary. According to one approach, cited from the Rishonim, women may become confused if at certain times a small amount of blood is considered impure. For example, seeing a small amount during the 7 clean days, while at others, this amount would not be impure. So the Shulchan Aruch, in codifying in Yoredai.
I'm sorry, so what we're saying is this. On the 4th day, she knows she has her Niddah.
What do you mean on the
right?
4th day?
On the 4th day of bleeding.
No, 4th day of bleeding. 1 day of bleeding.
I'm talking about Niddah. I'm talking
What-
about she's a
what-
Niddah, and she has bleeding for 4 consecutive days. What?
Go ahead.
She has 4 consecutive days, okay?
Right.
Fifth day, it stops.
She has to count Zayin Nikim.
Because
There is no more Torah law
because of
Zava, because she might be a Zava.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay, that's what it is.
Exactly. There is no more that you can count 3 more days and you're
No,
pure,
right.
because we have to assume that it's a Zava Gedola.
Right.
Any questions from anybody else? No. Everybody's with us so far? Yes. Okay. Shulchan Aruch says, Isha sheyatza damim kora, a woman who has blood coming from her uterus. Now, why is the Shulchan Aruch careful about that? Because, for example, if the blood is coming from the labia on the outside, so that's not uterine blood, that's not going to make her a Niddah. So if the blood is coming from Mimokora, Tmeya, even if she saw 1 drop of blood, the size of a mustard seed, Yosheves alav shiva nekiya, she counts 7 clean days. So Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, again in the Sefer Darchei Tahara, gives us a summary. Midin Torah, yeshnam shnei sugei tumas liisha, 2 types of tumah, Niddah v'zava. V'yesh harbe evdelim b'neihem. There's a lot of differences. Kagon li'inyan korbanos bisman shebeis hamidrash kayim. There was no korban by Niddah. There was a korban by zava. And li'inyan shivas nikiyim. There's no counting 7 clean days minat Torah during the Niddah period. Shezava gdola chayav lispor. She has to count as zava. V'od. Ach benos Yisrael achmir al atzman. But Jewish girls were stringent on themselves. She'al kol tipas dam ketana kachadal yosh v'sein shiva nekiyim k'mo zava gdola. Women count 7 days because of the possibility that she could be a zava gdola. V'sibot rabot lechumra. There are many reasons for this chumra. V'achashuva shebehenhi. The most important is it's sort of uniform counting. Each woman has to go through this complicated calculation, 7, 11, yes, I am in it, I'm not in it, etc. And not everybody was expert in this. So the Mordechai Eliyahu gives a reason for the chumrah to make everything uniform. Number 2, din zeh. Now, we know many times if people know that a law is only a chumrah, they'll say, they make a din, you don't have to be machmir. But Rav Eliyahu is saying that this halacha was completely different. This halacha was established as the halacha without anybody challenging it. The Gemara in Brachos, in Lamed Aleph gave it a digma halacha psuka legabe hanema bebraisa ein omdim lispal mitoch halacha psuka. It says you don't start davening until you learn a halacha psuka, a standard halacha that is accepted by everybody. What's the example that the Gemara gives as a halacha psuka? The Gemara brings this halacha, that women count 7 days for even a drop of blood. So that's we can't say, oh, it's chumras. No, it's not chumras. Already a long time ago in the Amoraic period, this became the standard halacha. Now, before concluding this section, we should note that the reason for the additional layers of stringency within Hilchos Niddah is due to the severity and sensitivity of the prohibition. As mentioned above, relations between a husband and wife during the Niddah period is subject to kares. Plus, one's desire in this area can sometimes lead one to engage in forbidden activities. Therefore, the sages and subsequent generations of authorities tried their utmost to prevent couples from reaching the stage that they might unintentionally transgress this prohibition. Let's learn a little bit at the beginning, the requirement of hargasha. We have learned so far that according to the practical halacha, a woman is treated as a niddah even upon seeing a small amount of blood. Nevertheless, not every episode of bleeding appears to render a woman as a niddah on a Torah level. The Gemara Niddah states that a woman does not become ritually impure as a niddah on a Torah level, even if she is certain that blood has been discharged from the uterus, unless she actually experiences a hargasha, a type of physical sensation associated with the blood leaving the uterus. Says Masechta Niddah Nun Zayin, Amud Beis, Omer Shmuel, Badka Karka Oilam V'Yashva Leha. Let's say a woman checked a piece of ground that she was sitting on before she sits down on it, and it's completely clean. And then she sits there, Umatza Damal, and then she gets up and she sees blood there. Tahora. She's not a niddah. Shenemar, Bibsara. The pasuk says she has to see the blood in her flesh. Ad shetargish bibsara. She has to she has to almost feeling dripping out of her uterus, dripping from the uterus, let's say into the vaginal canal. She has to have a sensation. Now we'll see. There's a massive debate. What sensation are we talking about? What sensation are we looking for that makes her a niddah versus if she doesn't have that hargasha, she's not a niddah? Now we're going to see. There's going to be a chumrah that maybe from a rabbinic level, even without a hargasha, she's going to have a certain level of tumah. But we're going to build this bit by bit. The Rambam records this condition as well, though he adds that she is still considered a niddah or deraisa, even if she did not sense the hargasha, as we assume that she did experience one, but did not realize it. Says the Rambam, Eina isha mitama min haTorah b'niddah b'ziva ad shetargish v'teira'eh dam v'yotza b'bsara. A woman she has to experience a physical sensation, and she has to discover blood that emerges within her flesh. Kamosha b'yarnu. There's no backwards, there's no retroactive tumah. She only becomes tumah from this moment on. That's going to be very relevant for us. The imlo yergisha, let's say a woman didn't have a sensation. Ubadkad, she checked herself. Umatza hadam lifnim biprozdor, and she sees the blood within the vaginal canal. We assume that she had a hargasha and she didn't feel it, and at least the Rambam holds that she's tamed midoraisa. Although a hargasha is required to bestow the status of a nidoraisa, discovering a stain of blood, for example, she sees a stain on her underwear, that's called a kesem, a stain, without a hargasha, still renders a woman ritually impure midrabanan, as explained in the Gemara and codified in the Shulchan Aruch. But then she's a niddah midrabanan, not midoraisa. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Dvar Torah, Ein ha'isha mitama v'lo asur l'bayla. A woman doesn't contaminate things with tumah and is not prohibited to her husband. Ad shetargish sheyetze dam b'fsara. She has this, whatever the sensation is that that blood left her flesh. The Chachamim gozru. Now the Chachamim made a gzeira. Al kol ketem shenimtza begufa or bibigdea, any spot of blood that she finds on her thigh or her clothing, shehi tmeya vasur labala. She's still ritually impure, and she's still prohibited to her husband. Afilu lo hirgisha, even without hargasha. Afilu badka atzma umatza tohira. This is even in a case where she sees a stain on her underwear or her thigh, and she takes a badika cloth with her fingers, and she inserts it in the vaginal canal, and she doesn't see any bleeding there. She is still tameh midrabanan because of the kesem. Utsricha hefsek tahara. She requires, she has to count zayin akiyim, and then she has to, we'll see, the hefsek tahara is going to be that she has to check herself either once or twice a day, and that she's clean of blood every day. Shetivdok atzma v'timtza tahara v'achar kach timna shiva nekiyim chutz miyom hamitzia. Just to count 7 days, excluding the day in which she discovered the bleeding. Just have mamish 7 clean days. Says the Ramah, ki'ilu ra'asa vadai. These halachas that are being applied to her is as if she mamish saw blood coming out, and with argosha. That kesem. Now, because the kesem is only tomei midrabanan, Chazal prescribed a number of leniencies when seeing a kesem, for example, such that it does not render her tomei in all cases. And these leniencies will be explored at greater length in the next year. But we will now discuss the condition of argosha in greater detail and how it applies nowadays. So I think it's a good place to stop, and we will start with the debate: what is considered hargosha for a woman when she sees blood that it would make her a Tamei Niddah midoraisa. Okay, any comments, questions?
Do you need hargosha for a zava as well?
Yes, you need hargosha for zava as well. Now, for the blood kechardal, we'll see. The stringency of Rab Zera is going to apply even however they see it. But in order to establish you as a Zava Gedola Minat Torah, that you're going to bring Korbanos and all that, it required Hagasha as well. Here, by the way, let's find the source for that. I think we mentioned it tonight.
Nothing. That you could ask any question that is not answered.
Oh yeah, Abe, look at the Rambam on page 33. Ein ha'isha mitameh min haTorah b'niddah o b'ziva ad shetargish. So the hargasha is required by both. Okay.
Okay, perfect.
So next week we're back to